You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking. In this episode, we'll examine some individuals, known and unknown, who have been discussed in the Zodiac community, and who predated the Zodiac killer's reign of terror in the Bay Area. 2 of these individuals used pseudonyms later used in confirmed and unconfirmed Zodiac communications, subsequent to July 31st, 1969, with the other connected through a double murder often touted as an early Zodiac crime. These connections are not being endorsed in this podcast, but simply examined to discover the possible roots of the Zodiac killer. He began his murderous rampage one cold winter night in December 1968. So let us travel back 21 years. before the Zodiac's reign of terror started. In December 1947, the newspapers reported that a resident of Albany, California, named William J. Keating, received a series of sinister notes that were attached to bamboo spears that were thrown into the backyard of his house at 918 Evelyn Avenue. The notes have caught the eye of many Zodiac researchers because they were slightly cryptic in nature and signed with the pseudonym the Red Phantom, exactly like one of the 1974 communications argued to be from the Zodiac. On July 8, 1974, someone mailed a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle columnist Mark H. Spinelli. The obituary of Mark H. Spinelli began with, quote, Mark H. Spinelli, better known to Chronicle readers as Count Marco, was a columnist who gave outrageous advice to women for 15 years. As Count Marco, Mr. Spinelli was a star performer in a circulation war in the 1960s between the Chronicle and other Bay Area papers. At the height of his fame, he wrote his newspaper column, appeared in his own daily television show, wrote 3 books, won prizes, and developed a huge audience that was either amused or appalled by his words. The 1974 letter to Count Marco was derogatory in nature, telling him to get back in the hellhole, and stating that he had a serious psychological disorder. It was signed the Red Phantom, and red with rage was bracketed underneath. The 1947 author of the notes had warned William Keating to, quote, keep your cat away from the house with the Skylark flag, with another of the notes stating, beware, and proclaiming that 3 clues will follow. The author of the notes was tracked down by Officer Dave Perkins, and the writer turned out to be a 9-year-old boy who kept pigeons and complained that William Keating's cat was threatening them. Recently, the identity of the 9-year-old boy has been unearthed as Ronald Gilstrap, although some people have noted that he was 11 years old possibly in 1947, not 9 as reported in newspapers. This would have made Ronald Gilstrap 33 years old at the time of the Paul Stine murder in 1969, and 38 by the time the Red Phantom letter was received by the San Francisco Chronicle in 1974. The only connection between the Zodiac killer case and Ronald Gilstrap is the pseudonym, the Red Phantom.
The Red Phantom would also emerge via 2 San Francisco newspaper articles in 1962 and 1969, both of which used disparaging commentary towards Count Marco. The first letter to Count Marco appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on October 2nd, 1962, stating, Dear Count Marco, instead of sneaking up on women like a red phantom with black paint, you should work openly and usefully to help this free and generous country which feeds your nasty face. Chicago. The second letter to Count Marco appeared in the San Francisco Sunday Examiner and Chronicle on January the 12th, 1969, stating, Dear Count Marco, Instead of sneaking up on women like a red phantom with black paint, you should work openly and usefully to help this free and generous country which feeds your nasty face. You must belong to the Ku Klux Klan the way you talk about American women. I don't know why I'm writing this anyway. You're just full of shit. Happily married. One was signed Chicago and one was signed Happily Married, but both carried the identical introduction of 34 words, separated by just over 6 years. These letters to Count Marco in 1962 and 1969 mirrored the purported Zodiac letter in 1974 by using the same combative language, in equally brief format, and through a common pseudonym in every instance. Were the 1960s letters a fledgling Zodiac killer who would dust down this pseudonym in 1974, a different author to the 1974 letter, or the same author but not the Zodiac killer? There has been much discussion on the validity of the Red Phantom letter, so I suggest you take a look at its envelope and the envelope that carried the SLA letter, mailed on February the 3rd, 1974. Just add exaggerated tales to the letter F, letter H, and letter T on the SLA envelope, and now compare both these envelopes alongside each other. Bearing in mind that neither envelope was released into the public domain, it becomes evident the same author created both communications. Therefore, if we can prove that the SLA letter was not authored by the Zodiac killer, we can simultaneously prove the Red Phantom letter also wasn't Zodiac. For the SLA letter to be considered genuine Zodiac material, we have to consider the Zodiac killer a soothsayer. According to most observers, we would have to believe that the Zodiac killer went silent for nearly 3 years before devoting an entire letter exclusively referencing the Symbionese Liberation Army, the day before the Symbionese Liberation Army's most high-profile crime, the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst on February the 4th, 1974. The SLA letter began with Dear and was signed with A Friend. Then just 7 days later, on February the 10th, 1974, the Symbionese Liberation Army Group mailed a letter to the Hearst family which began with Dear and was signed with A Friend. In other words, not only did Zodiac have impeccable timing with the SLA letter being mailed almost in tandem with a Hearst kidnapping, he managed to predict the introduction and signature of an authentic Symbionese Liberation Army letter 7 days in advance. Neither communication was published in the newspapers. The Zodiac killer probably had a crystal ball.
A young individual, known only as Sandy, came across Stephen Straub, who was 16 years old, while at the beach boardwalk area in Santa Cruz. The two talked for a while, with Sandy stating that he had a knife that needed sharpening, before revealing a kitchen-type knife to Straub. Sandy also claimed that he had run away from Oakland 3 days earlier, and had been sleeping rough, and saying he was hungry. It was here in Santa Cruz that Sandy met two other teenagers, James L. Coleman and J.C. Reed, who together began a mini crime spree. Stephen Straub would later draw a sketch of Sandy. On June 5, 1963, after a hotel clerk became suspicious of Coleman and Reed and called police, investigators traveled to Santa Cruz to apprehend both James L. Coleman and J.C. Reed for the fatal stabbing of Vernon Charles Smith, 63 years old, in Lompoc. He was killed during a robbery a few days earlier. In the room of the Palomar Hotel in which they were staying, police retrieved the .22 caliber pistol. Under questioning about the stabbing, the two young men claimed their vehicle had run out of gas, and they asked Vernon Smith for his assistance. Neither of these young men were considered suspects in the Domingos Edwards slayings, but they implicated a third person called Sandy in the murder of Vernon Smith on June 2, 1963, adding that Sandy spoke of buying a .22 caliber rifle, and this obviously piqued the interest of investigators. The two youths had admitted to investigators their part in the robbery of Vernon Smith, but claimed it was Sandy who perpetrated the murder of the Good Samaritan at San Miguelito Canyon, approximately 3 miles south of Lompoc. He was discovered lying on his back in a gravel ditch toward the front side of his green 1951 Willys Jeep pickup. Close by was the gasoline can and fuel that had been acquired by Vernon Smith from a nearby gas station to help the teenagers. His cause of death was knife wound to the back, which penetrated his heart. Coleman and Reed were eventually convicted in the Santa Barbara County Court and sentenced to 5 years to life for second-degree murder. Sandy was then sought for questioning in relation to the Dominguez and Edwards murders on June 4, 1963. Santa Barbara detectives later stated they discovered a vehicle stolen by the three youths, and inside retrieved some clothing thought to have been owned by Sandy. The clothing contained the names Robert Kaufman and William Carr, and police believe that one of those might be the real name of Sandy. Mabel Keener, manager at the Royal Motel, Royal Grand, testified that a boy resembling Sandy came into her hotel at 4 a.m. on June 3rd and registered as William Carr of Bakersfield. He stayed until the next morning and then left. She declared the sheriff's composite drawing of Sandy, as made by Hal Clark, resembled Sandy in some ways, but not exactly about the mouth and hair. Lompoc gas station attendants also testified. Sarah said he waited on Vernon Smith that night when he drove up in his Jeep, which also contained a youth resembling Sandy. Vernon Smith, who was playing the part of Good Samaritan, filling up a gas can to take to the youth's stalled car in Miguelito Canyon, drove off with a full can of gas. Sandy was described as 17 to 18 years old, 5'8" in height and 150 pounds, and he smoked Pall Mall cigarettes.
The day after Sandy was spotted at the Royal Motel in Arroyo Grande, somebody armed with a gun, knife, and pre-cut lengths of rope callously murdered Robert George Dominguez, aged 18, and Linda Faye Edwards, aged 17, on a remote beach in Canada del Molino, Santa Barbara, on June the 4th, 1963. The young couple were mercilessly gunned down by a fusillade of shots in the back as they attempted to escape their attacker. Robert Dominguez was shot 11 times, while Linda Edwards was targeted 8 times. It was a sunny afternoon when the killer approached the couple, armed with what was thought to be a .22 caliber long rifle, a weapon ideal for target shooting with minimum recoil. The murder of the couple and the stabbing of Vernon Smith at Miguelito Canyon, just 15 miles west of the Santa Barbara beach, coupled with the information given to investigators by Coleman and Reed of Sandy thinking about buying a .22 rifle, probably pushed Sandy to the top of the suspect list in the Dominguez and Edwards murders. The fact that the murders of Robert Dominguez and Linda Edwards have been compared to the attack at Lake Berryessa on September the 27th, 1969, it's easy to see how Sandy has been suggested as a fledgling Zodiac killer. This would have made Sandy approximately 24 years of age by the time of the Lake Berryessa attack, in line with the voice concept estimation of the killer given by Brian Hartnell of 20 to 30 years, but extremely young in comparison to the eyewitnesses at Presidio Heights on October the 11th, 1969. If Sandy was in possession of a knife, as claimed by Stephen Straub, and was actively seeking a .22 caliber rifle as claimed by Coleman and Reed, then we have the two key ingredients used by the killer of Robert Dominguez and Linda Edwards. Bearing in mind, investigators believed a knife was used to cut Linda Edwards' bathing costume after the murders. The bodies of Robert Dominguez and Linda Edwards were dragged a combined total of 60 feet to a makeshift shack, requiring a considerable effort over rough terrain. So unless this 150-pound Sandy had some assistance in subduing two victims and relocating their bodies, the likelihood Sandy was the sole perpetrator in this crime appears slim. However, we do know he was capable of murder, having stabbed Vernon Smith less than 48 hours ago, and was quite capable of forming alliances with other maladjusted teenagers.
First coming to prominence in the Robert Graysmith book, a high school student named Zode was an outcast and misfit, and treated unfavorably by other students. It's been reported that in 1964 in San Bernardino, a Pacific High School student who other classmates called Big Bad Zode had adorned himself with the moniker Zodiac, and had once marched to the front of the classroom and wrote Zodiac on the chalkboard. It's been claimed that Zode said that he would kill people and secure them as slaves in his afterlife. I was intrigued to find out more about this character, contemplating the fact that the murderer of 5 may have given himself this mysterious title long before it was declared in the debut of Zodiac letter on August 4th, 1969. After searching the 1960s yearbook, I found a photo of the young man in question and was surprised to discover he had placed the signature Zodiac beneath his photograph. It was at that point that I knew I had to contact him to get the full story, not expecting that he would reply or freely admit to the moniker he had attributed himself during his school days. But I was wrong. In a letter and subsequent phone calls, the now older man willingly admitted to calling himself Zodiac in the mid-1960s, but denied ever threatening to kill people to collect slaves in the afterlife. But he did confess to an interest in attorney Melvin Belli, as well as movies. He mailed me a sample of his handwriting that bore no comparison to known Zodiac letters. So despite my early optimism, I concluded that this individual was very unlikely to have become the Zodiac. While one door seemingly closed, it did pop open another possibility, that perhaps a Pacific High School classmate or friend of Zode carried the torch of the Zodiac moniker, and later used it to besiege the residents in the Bay Area in Northern California. After all, the Zodiac killer was inspired to adopt the moniker from somewhere, and bearing in mind the non-canonical connection of the Zodiac to Riverside and the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, a true connection through Zode may still exist, even if he wasn't the Zodiac.
The roots of the Zodiac killer have often been sought to unearth the identity of the man behind the mask, with investigators searching for early correspondence to editors of the newspapers, or uncovering earlier and more basic crimes. Many believe the Lake Herman Road murders were simply too daring to be a jumping-off point for the Zodiac killer, but the earlier murders of taxicab driver Ray Davis, Robert Dominguez and Linda Edwards, and Johnny and Joyce Swindle are equally daring in their own right. The murder of Sherry Jo Bates in 1966, although exhibiting pre-planning, showed elements of inexperience in a prolonged and vicious attack. This was, however, committed between two buildings only yards from the Riverside Library. If we are looking for an early murder connected to the Zodiac killer, we could be looking for an extremely simple crime with little risk attached. This could very well be a crime in an area once inhabited by the Zodiac killer, and hence his reluctance to admit to a murder in a location he once resided. Sandy, Pigeon Boy, and Zode are extremely unlikely to be the actual Bay Area murderer, but these examples give us an idea of what we may be looking for in our relentless search for the Zodiac killer. The murder of Vernon Smith in 1963 being a good example of an early crime, that just whetted the appetite of a budding murderer. This type of crime, allied to somebody with superior intelligence, would certainly have been a dangerous combination in years to come. In essence, we probably need to be looking for an early crime that bears little resemblance to the Zodiac killer's attacks in 1968 and 1969. If the Lake Herman Road murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were the culmination of that experience, then his earlier crimes, where he may have made more mistakes, is probably where our collective focus should be channeled. We can all probably agree that the Zodiac killer was a narcissistic braggart who enjoyed the attention he received from his crimes and communications. If the Zodiac killer was approximately 40 years old in 1969, as testified to by 3 sets of eyewitnesses on October the 11th, 1969, then there are at least 2 decades of adulthood where this killer had the opportunity to converse with the newspapers and commit many more crimes. We could be looking for a killer's fingerprint as early as the mid-1940s, anywhere in America, and not exclusively in California, as we are often tempted to search for the identity of the Zodiac killer.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
So, irrespective of my thoughts on the Red Phantom letter, Mike, the letters to the editor of the Examiner and Chronicle in 62 and 69 using the Red Phantom phrase twice is a very good find. And these I would suggest are clearly the same person. What are your thoughts on these two letters to the editor?
Well, it's clear that the second letter is almost verbatim a duplicate of the first letter to Count Marco, with the difference being the language at the end of it. So my thinking was someone had either found the original letter to the editor of Count Marco and duplicated but changed the ending, or perhaps Count Marco and his team of editors, whatever, just decided to use one of their old letters they had received and change the ending themselves. I don't know what the procedure was, if that's something they normally did, if they would sort of recycle letters and used ones they had gotten long ago and just sort of put different endings on them to give them a new spin, or if it was someone that simply knew about that first letter, duplicated it, and just changed the ending. I don't think we can determine that.
If somebody contacted the editors the second time, it's probably a very slim chance, trawling through many newspaper articles, that they would stumble across this to then repeat for apparently no reason. What do you think?
Yeah, and it's possible that I think if they had written the original letter in the early 60s and then years later, I think they'd have a hard time remembering the exact every word they used to be able to duplicate it. So perhaps they had a copy of the newspaper from when their letter aired and they were just sort of rewriting it, because I don't think from memory they'd be able to duplicate every word they used up until that ending part.
In the 1930s, Lee Falk created the comic strip The Phantom. Eventually, this comic strip was bought by William Randolph Hearst's King Features. Both the Badlands card and Red Phantom letter carried the same theme. One asked for cutting of ads for the Badlands movie, and the other asked for the cancelling of the Count Marco column. Irrespective of whether we believe they were Zodiac or not, do you think they were written by one author?
On the fence on that, I don't know. There definitely seem to be some common themes and some interesting language and things that sort of mirror each other, but Count Marco was someone that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, so he might have had more than one person that wanted to see his column canceled or ended. So that part wouldn't necessarily surprise me, that more than one person could want that. But to me, it's just kind of hard to determine if it was actually the same exact person that's, sort of repeating these things through those different correspondences.
Do you lean towards the Badlands letter being more likely Zodiac than the Red Phantom letter?
I'm sort of on the fence on that one. There's quite a bit of speculation that one of the 1974 letters is not real or is not confirmed. And I sort of go between the SLA letter and Badlands letter being, one of those two letters being the one that might not be real, especially the SLA letter. I lean more towards that one not being legitimate if one of them's not legitimate. But because in the Badlands letter, it doesn't say this is the Zodiac speaking, so someone just randomly saw that and thought this has to be Zodiac. I don't know what they were basing that on. Maybe the writing looked like Zodiac's. I don't know, but it's hard to say. But it is interesting that some of the themes, sort of pop up again here and there.
This comic strip, created by Lee Falk, appeared in the daily newspaper, but it wasn't coloured. And then this comic strip was taken on, and there was a series of books created called the Better Little Book series that featured this Phantom. The first book was called The Phantom in 1936, and it featured the Phantom in a reddish-brown colour on the cover, as did the next book called The Phantom and the Sign of the Skull in 1939. All later books featured the usual blue or purple costume for the Phantom. I typed in Red Phantom into Google, and it produces next to nothing of significance. So where did the author of the 1962 and 69 letters to the editor get their idea for the Red Phantom, along with the Pigeon Boy in 1947 that we'll come on to in a minute, and the person behind the 1974 letter, when they had no access to the internet and couldn't scour around, but they all apparently found the Red Phantom quite easily?
Well, that's all open to speculation. It's interesting that someone would choose those words, but, I think people have pointed out there was a wrestler known as the Red Phantom. There was some kind of fish known as the Red Phantom. There was a bicycle, as I recall, that was known as the Red Phantom. So people have thrown all these different things out where the person could have gotten that term Red Phantom from. So, it's interesting. It seems like the Red Phantom letter definitely tied to Count Marco, and we know Zodiac read those newspapers and would have been familiar with Count Marco. So, where he got the choice of Red Phantom from, I don't know. I think it was also an old movie, if I remember correctly, and we know Zodiac may have been an old movie buff, and so who knows? I think it's open to interpretation, open to opinion where that phrase came from.
The movie wasn't actually called The Red Phantom, though, was it? It was translated because it was a foreign film, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it translated to Red Phantom. So, but again, could it have been named after the fish or the wrestler or the bike? Who knows?
I did find Red Phantom as in Rolls Royce as well, but because it was used in a sinister element in this contact to Count Marco, one would think the origins of the name Red Phantom would have a sinister element to it rather than, say, a goldfish or a car.
Yeah, you think that might be the case.
Now, Mark Spinelli's column was filled with outrageous and misogynistic advice for women, so it wouldn't be unusual to find women contacting Count Marco, as you just said, and venting their anger. As well as the 1962 and 69 letters to the editor, have you considered the possibility that the Red Phantom letter from 1974 was authored by a woman? And why did this correspondence ever get placed in the potential authentic Zodiac communications list, other than handwriting, which most people look at and say looks nothing like early Zodiac letters?
I've heard that theory before, that perhaps a woman wrote the Red Phantom letter. Again, it's all about open to interpretation, open to opinion about handwriting. When I look at the writing, I see Zodiac's writing. To me, that's a Zodiac letter. I don't have any doubts in my mind personally, but could a woman have written it if it wasn't the Zodiac? It's possible, and that's what some people have put forward. I just think that it definitely was Zodiac, in my opinion.
Well, let's shift topics and go and talk about Sandy. This so-called Sandy was a coward who stabbed a helpful old man in the back and a teenager who weighed 150 pounds. It is a bit of a leap of faith that this person had the mettle to be able to plan a crime that required using restraints, necessitated the control of two individuals such as Dominguez and Edwards without an accomplice, especially when we consider both bodies were moved a total of 60 feet from beach to the shack. Do you lean towards one or two people being responsible for this? Because according to John Averitt, there is evidence of the couple being dragged to the shack, contrary to the notion of two people.
Well, I guess first off, we have to clarify that we don't know for sure that he stabbed the elderly man. That's true. The two defendants claim that this mysterious Sandy did that. But, if there's evidence of dragging, it would be hard to drag two people in the sand as one single person, 150 pounds. Obviously, if, your adrenaline's flowing, you're trying to hide, you're desperate to hide a body, whatever, I think it could be possible, but again, not easy. I think the evidence, based on what John Everett said and based on what some of the police have hinted at, seems to point to one offender, I think, which is why they really suspected it was Zodiac. But I don't think there's anything there solid enough to make a determination on. I do think it's interesting that there, if you look at the clues, supposedly this Sandy had stolen a .22 rifle, if I remember correctly, or had access to one, and then that may have been the weapon that was used. That's interesting. It's in the same area. There were also reports of a sniper shooting at people on the beach leading up to Dominguez and Edwards being murdered. I think it's highly likely that the sniper took it a step further and attacked Dominguez and Edwards up close and personal. So I think they started out as a sniper and did that. To me, two people sharing that secret and not spilling it, I think that would be tough. So to me, I think it makes me think it was one person, because I just think eventually someone would spill that secret and it wouldn't stay secret for long. So I think it was one person. Whether it was Zodiac or not, that's open to debate.
But unlikely Sandy.
Well, again, Sandy, if he was a skinny 150-pound kid dragging two bodies across the sand, definitely would be difficult, but probably not impossible. So I don't think I can say.
I did consider that Sandy may have been a fictitious person made up by Coleman and Reed, but there was Stephen Straub who mentioned his interactions with Sandy as well. So that sort of verifies Coleman and Reed's mention of a Sandy also, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, I know there were people by that name. They thought his name really may have been Robert Kaufman. One other name as well could have been a possibility. And there were people that sort of matched that description, that age, that looked a little bit like him with those names. But I think they were pretty much cleared by police that investigated them. And then, of course, there was the one guy whose name I haven't seen in quite a while that was actually arrested in connection with being Sandy, and he turned out not to be Sandy. So it's just it's an interesting possibility. Is it simply just a scapegoat, or is it a real person? After all this time, I doubt we're ever going to find out.
The remote location of their murders down the path from Highway 101 suggests the perpetrator or perpetrators were familiar with this location. Sandy had earlier claimed he had run away from Oakland shortly before this crime, so unless he was extremely familiar with the Santa Barbara coastline, he surely is an unlikely candidate for a budding Zodiac killer, isn't he?
Yeah, that's true. And then again, if you take into account if the earlier shootings of people on the beach, the sniper attacks, if they're connected to the Domingos Edwards attack, they seem to have been going on for a period of weeks when the Sandy supposedly had just shown up in Santa Barbara. So I don't think he could have been the sniper. And if the sniper was the killer of Domingos and Edwards, I don't think that Sandy could have been the sniper, because I think he just got to the area.
On the west side, there was that sniper who shot at a bunch of teenagers. And to the right of the Domingos Edwards east was the sound of gunshots being heard early in the morning by people camping nearby. So they're the two events you're talking about.
Yeah, and to me, I find it difficult to believe that there's someone willing to shoot at people on the beach and then later a couple's killed on the beach by gun. I find it hard to believe that those two things are not the same person. I think they were the same person, personally.
In 2016, Robert Domingos' cousin, when asked if he thought the Zodiac killer was responsible for the couple's murder, he said no. He thought that Robert knew his killer and noted that Robert had bruising on his knuckles, suggesting he fought against his attacker or attackers. I don't know what you think, Mike, but if the couple were relocated to the shack for the sole purpose of using the shack as a fuel source to destroy evidence and identity, this certainly could point to somebody known to the victims, and apparently Sandy would not have been known to either Domingos or Edwards. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I personally, I don't know why the killer would drag them to the shack in the first place to get rid of evidence anyway. If they had wrestled and there was, they didn't know about DNA or anything back then, but had they wrestled, maybe thought, okay, can they get fingerprints off of him somehow that I just grabbed him? So maybe I better burn the bodies to get rid of the fingerprints. Maybe there was blood and some of the blood got on him and he thought, okay, some of my blood's on him. They'll tell what blood type I am, so I need to burn the bodies. I don't see why the bodies would need to be burned in the first place unless there was some kind of contact. Because if he simply had shot them with no touching them at all, he could have just left them laying right on the beach where he shot them. So the fact that he wanted to burn the bodies tells me that there was some kind of physical contact and he didn't want to take any chances. He wanted to destroy that evidence.
In the 1960s, if you found bodies and they were basically skeletons or had been burnt beyond recognition, the only way of identifying people back then would have been really facial reconstruction of the skeleton. So maybe that's what the killer or killers thought in this instance. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but we didn't have DNA or anything like that, which wouldn't have worked today. because you could still take DNA from bone marrow or any sort of material that was left at the scene, which would have been much easier to disguise the identity of a victim back in 1960.
Yeah, I think they could have still used dental records, probably.
Yes, probably. Yes, that's a fair point.
But then again, at the same time, if you have two local teenagers that go missing and then two burned bodies are found on the beach, I think it would be pretty clear to investigators that those two burned bodies are probably your two missing people, and they would have probably dug a little bit deeper and determined if it was them. So I don't understand the whole burning of them, other than if it's just to cover up some kind of evidence, and maybe it's an inexperienced killer that's just panicking and says, hey, I don't know what clues I've left, but just in case, let me burn everything. I don't know, because he could have simply, if he just wanted to kill them, he could have just shot them and walked away and left their bodies there, and it wouldn't really leave any evidence. So to me, he was trying to cover up something, possibly that he had physically interacted with them.
Shall we move over to San Bernardino?
Yeah, definitely.
Have you got anything extra to add in about Zode that we haven't already discussed in the intro?
Well, Zode was a character. I'll say that. He was, when I first read about him, I said to myself, wow, I wonder if this person was real. I wonder if he really existed. And when I located him and talked to him and he admitted to it, it was quite interesting. And had he lived in Vallejo, he would have been, I think, high on the police radar, because I think he was, as many people would describe, as odd. He had never been on a date. He was a bit of a loner. He was he was picked on, and he admitted to calling himself Zodiac in the mid 1960s. So,
how old was he when he called himself Zodiac?
So he graduated in 1965, I believe. And so in high school, when he was calling himself Zodiac, he was 17, 18, 19, somewhere in there. So that's before the Zodiac ever called himself Zodiac. I always wondered if not him, and I don't think he was the Zodiac by any stretch. In fact, I'm confident he wasn't the Zodiac, but I always wondered if somehow the real Zodiac had gone to school with him and witnessed him being picked on and witnessed himself calling himself Zodiac, and then later on stole that moniker for himself. A very interesting character for sure.
And didn't he place the Zodiac moniker on his yearbook?
Yeah, he signed things as Zodiac in the yearbooks, and he freely admitted to calling himself. He never denied it. When I spoke to him, he admitted that he was. He has an interesting cadence to his speech as well. He has an interesting drawl. Again, if he had lived in Northern California at the time of the Zodiac murders, I think he would have been high on police radar, sort of like an Arthur Lee Allen. But everything I've found places him solely in Southern California, and I think he's only been to San Francisco a couple times in his life. And we know that Zodiac, whoever he was, mailed letters on a regular basis from San Francisco. So I think it would easily exclude him. And investigators I spoke to, they're aware of this guy Zode, and they checked him out. So I think they're confident wasn't Zodiac, as am I.
You said he had a sort of drawl. Was his origins or his family based in Southern California, or did they have their roots elsewhere?
Yeah, they were San Bernardino. I think he lived his whole life in San Bernardino. I think he may have been born in Riverside or gone to college there, or gone to school there when he was younger. They lived in Riverside. San Bernardino. They owned some kind of market or a restaurant there. So he grew up there, and I think he had a family member at one time that opened up some kind of shop in San Francisco, but he had only visited San Francisco a couple times, and we know Zodiac was pretty much a regular to the San Francisco area to mail all those letters. So, I think he was ruled out. And again, more importantly, I think police looked at him and ruled him out. So, but it was interesting nonetheless that here's someone that would call himself Zodiac years before Zodiac ever came out. And he sort of fits the stereotype of what a lot of people think Zodiac may have been. I just think he happens to be a red herring, and he himself wasn't the Zodiac.
So I suppose a much more important question to ask then is, we often ask, as Zodiac researchers, where did the Zodiac get his idea for his pseudonym? Was it the horoscope? Was it the Zodiac watch? Was he interested in astrology? So did you ask Zode where he got the name Zodiac from? What inspired him?
Yeah, I did, and I think he just said that he was into astrology and stuff at the time, which just about everyone was back in the 60s. It was sort of a big popular thing. There were all kinds of business names with Zodiac in the title, so I think it was really just a common name. Now, again, you can argue about where Zodiac chose it from. To me, it seems like he probably got it off the watch, since the symbol and the name appear together. If I had to guess, I'd say he got it off the watch, but that's open to debate.
We don't know for certain that the Zodiac wasn't responsible for the Sherry Joe Bates murder or the communications in 1966 and 67. And this probably still remains the strongest non-canonical crime attached to the Zodiac story. So does this strengthen the case for somebody associated with Zode, or somebody who knew of him, taking this pseudonym and reinventing it in 1969? The word Zodiac, as you've just stated, wasn't unusual in the 1960s, but we have an individual calling himself Zodiac in San Bernardino, a murder in Riverside, and the Zodiac later being attached to this area by investigators. So that's probably the closest we'll ever get to somebody being Zodiac without him being Zodiac, as you just stressed.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to overlook all that stuff. And you also have, for example, you have Kathleen Johns. Now, she's not a confirmed Zodiac victim, but she happened to be driving up from San Bernardino. She actually lived a mile from Zode, so she's driving up to Petaluma, and someone coming from behind her attacked her. So you could argue that, if it was Zodiac or whoever it was, is coming from behind her, may have been coming from the same area as her. So I thought that was interesting. Zode also had an interest and a fascination with Melvin Belli, which pretty much how it happened in the book was very much how it happened in real life for him. He sort of questioned at this Melvin Belli meetup in the San Bernardino area, and Belli asked him flat out if he was Zodiac, and I think he was nervous, and he sort of downplayed it as there wasn't this group of detectives that pounced on him. It was more or less the questioning. But again, on paper, he looked like a very interesting suspect. In reality, though, I don't think, pretty obvious that he wasn't the Zodiac.
What were the interests of Zode that led him to have a fascination with Melvin Belli then?
I think he was doing some kind of college course, and it's been quite a while since I talked to him, so I'm going by memory, but I think he was taking some kind of college course related to legal stuff, or maybe he was thinking about getting into law. So it was sort of that connection. And when he heard that Melvin Belli was going to be there at this event, he was interested in going to hear him. And it's interesting. He even, I remember his letter, seeing it when he wrote back, he wrote something like, Melvin Belli, the king of torts. He wrote that in the letter that he sent to me. So, it was so interesting to see so many things connect and him admit to so many things that were very Zodiac-like. But the more I looked at his writing, the more I examined his background and where he lived, I was convinced he wasn't the Zodiac. But again, could someone that was in his circle of friends or someone that was a schoolmate of his gone on to use that moniker because they were familiar with him and stole it from him? That's a possibility, I think.
So what did he become immediately after college? Do we know what profession he went into?
He sort of bounced around. He didn't get into anything as a long-term career. I think he did a variety of jobs, security. He was a member of Toastmasters. Nothing as far as a specific career path. So, and again, part of it was, I think he was involved in his family's business, and then when his parents passed away, he sort of lived in the same house. He's someone that didn't have internet, wasn't up to speed on tech stuff, wasn't aware of what was being written about him on message boards and on forums. So it was a little bit of a shock to him. But he fully admitted that he called himself the Zodiac and confirmed a lot of the stuff that was written about him. Some of it he disputed, of course, as well. But, he was a real person, and it's interesting to ponder whether Zodiac stole his moniker from him.
Going back to the Red Phantom, have you decided in yourself where that moniker was taken from, that pseudonym?
Yeah, the Red Phantom, I'm sort of, again, up in the air. Could be some obscure reference in a book someplace, something that meant something to him. Maybe it was, again, something as simple as the name of a bike. There's any number of scenarios, and I really don't know. And at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter if it's Zodiac, it's Zodiac, wherever they got the name from.
And didn't the Red Phantom appear in a Marin County theater around the period of Zodiac?
Yeah, I believe it did. I'd have to go back and check that, but if you're saying it did, you're probably correct. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Murder, She Told. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Growing up as a latchkey kid in a small town in Maine, I always assumed I was safe. After all, unless it makes national news, murder isn't something people talk about around here. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Murder, She Told is a true crime podcast featuring crime stories, unsolved murders and missing persons, and baffling cold cases from my home state of Maine, New England, and small towns across America. These are the crime stories your hometown doesn't want to talk about, the mysteries buried deep in the newspaper archives of local American history. These are the homicides you've probably never heard of before. Through detailed storytelling and connections with family, friends, and investigators closest to the case, Murder, She Told will hit home for any true crime fan, whether you're from Maine or from away. Visit murdershetold.com to suggest your hometown crime story, and subscribe now wherever you get your favorite podcasts. I'm Kristen Seavey, and this is Murder, She Told.